The first crack of thunder sent Katherine Everett diving under the wagon before she even realized what her body was doing. Her heart hammering so violently she thought it might break free from her chest entirely. The year was 1878, and she had traveled all the way from Philadelphia to White Oaks, New Mexico Territory, seeking a fresh start after her parents' death. But no amount of distance could cure the terror that seized her whenever storms rolled across the sky. She pressed herself against the rough wooden wheel, trembling as lightning split the darkening afternoon in jagged white lines, illuminating the dusty street and the scattered buildings of this frontier town that was supposed to be her new beginning. "Miss, you all right down there?" The voice came from above, deep and rough like gravel tumbling down a mountainside, and Katherine looked up to see a man crouching beside the wagon, his broad shoulders blocking out what little light remained as the storm gathered strength overhead. He had the kind of face that looked carved from the mountains themselves, all hard angles and weathered brown skin, with dark hair that fell past his shoulders and eyes the color of pine forests. His build was massive, muscles straining against a leather shirt that had seen better days, and there was something about the way he held himself, solid and unmoving, that made him seem like he could stand against anything nature threw at him. "I am perfectly fine, thank you," Katherine lied through chattering teeth as another boom of thunder rolled across the valley, causing her to squeeze her eyes shut and press harder against the wagon wheel. She knew she looked ridiculous, a 22-year-old woman cowering like a child, but the fear was bigger than her pride, bigger than her sense of propriety, bigger than anything else in the world when the storms came. The man did not move away. Instead, he settled into a more comfortable position, his back against the wagon as rain began to fall in fat, heavy drops that kicked up little clouds of dust before turning the street to mud. "Name is Garrett Voss," he said, his voice somehow cutting through the sound of the storm without raising in volume. "Been living up in the Jicarilla Mountains for about 8 years now. Come down every few weeks for supplies." Katherine wanted to tell him to leave her alone, that she did not need a mountain man with too long hair and hands the size of dinner plates watching her have a breakdown in the middle of White Oaks Main Street. But another lightning strike turned the world white, and the words caught in her throat, coming out as nothing more than a frightened whimper. She hated herself for it, hated the way fear made her small and helpless, hated that she could not be the strong, independent woman she had promised herself she would become out here in the West. Without asking permission, Garrett reached under the wagon, and before Katherine could protest, he had pulled her out into the rain and lifted her as easily as if she weighed nothing at all. She should have fought, should have demanded he put her down, but the storm was everywhere, pressing in from all sides, and when he pulled her against his chest, sheltering her with his body as he strode quickly across the street toward the general store, she found herself clinging to his shirt instead. The store was dim and musty, smelling of leather and tobacco and coffee beans, and blessedly quiet once Garrett kicked the door shut behind them. He set Katherine down gently on a wooden chair near the counter, and she immediately felt foolish, her dress soaked through and dripping onto the floorboards, her carefully pinned hair coming loose in wet strands around her face. The store's owner, an older man named Mr. Patterson, who had been kind to her when she arrived in town 2 weeks ago, looked over with concern. "Miss Everett, are you hurt?" he asked, already reaching for a blanket he kept behind the counter. "Just frightened," Garrett answered before Katherine could, taking the blanket and draping it over her shoulders with surprising gentleness for hands so large and rough. Storms do not sit well with her. Katherine wanted to snap at him for answering on her behalf, but she was still shaking too hard to manage much beyond pulling the blanket tighter and trying to steady her breathing. Outside, the storm raged, thunder rolling in continuous waves that made the store's windows rattle. Each sound sent a fresh spike of terror through her chest, irrational and overwhelming, and she found herself focusing on Garrett instead, on the solid reality of him standing nearby like a mountain that could not be moved. "Been that way long?" he asked, his tone conversational rather than pitying, which Katherine appreciated more than she could express. "Since I was 7, she heard herself say, surprising herself with the answer. She never talked about the storm that had blown through Philadelphia and destroyed their neighbor's house, killing everyone inside while Katherine and her parents huddled in their basement listening to the world tear itself apart. "A tree fell on the house next to ours during a terrible storm. I saw what lightning could do." Garrett nodded slowly, pulling up another chair and sitting down backwards on it, his arms resting on the back as he watched her with those steady pine-colored eyes. "That makes sense. Fear is not irrational when it comes from seeing real danger." It was such a simple statement, but something about the matter-of-fact way he said it, without judgment or condescension, made Katherine feel like she could breathe a little easier. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the storm rage outside, and gradually Katherine's heartbeat began to slow, her hands unclenching from the blanket's edges. "What brings you to White Oaks?" Garrett asked after a time, and Katherine recognized it for what it was, an attempt to distract her from the thunder still rumbling overhead. "My parents died 6 months ago," she said, staring at her hands. "Cholera. There was nothing left for me in Philadelphia except memories and debts. My father's business partner helped me sell everything and suggested I come west, make a fresh start. He had a cousin here who needed help running the schoolhouse." "You are a teacher then?" "I am trying to be," Katherine corrected. "I helped in my father's school back home, but running one on my own is different. The children here are different too. Rougher, more independent. They do not see much point in learning about poetry and proper grammar when they are more concerned with survival." Garrett's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. "Sounds like you need to teach them things that matter out here then." "I suppose that is fair criticism," Katherine admitted, "though I confess I am still learning what matters out here myself." The storm continued for another 20 minutes, and through it all, Garrett stayed right there, asking Katherine questions about Philadelphia and her journey west, telling her stories about the mountains that clearly loved, describing the way sunrise looked from the peaks and how the air changed with the seasons. His voice was like an anchor, steady and unwavering, and Katherine found herself talking more than she had in months, the fear gradually receding as she focused on the conversation instead of the thunder. When the rain finally began to taper off and the thunder grew distant, Katherine stood on shaking legs and handed the blanket back to Mr. Patterson with a grateful smile. "Thank you for the shelter," she said, then turned to Garrett. "And thank you for your kindness." "I apologize for being so much trouble." "You were not any trouble," Garrett said simply, rising from his chair and making the space suddenly seem smaller. Up close, Katherine could see the small scars that marked his hands and forearms, evidence of a life lived hard and outdoors. "Where are you staying?" "Mrs. Henderson runs a boarding house on the edge of town. I have a room there." "I will walk you back. Storm might not be done yet." Katherine wanted to protest that she could manage on her own, but the sky was still dark and threatening, and the thought of being caught out in another wave of thunder made her stomach twist. So she nodded instead, and they walked together through the muddy streets, past buildings built from rough-hewn wood and adobe, past the saloon where piano music had started up again, and men's laughter spilled out into the wet evening air. "How often do you come to town?" Katherine asked as they walked, surprised to find she wanted to know the answer. "Every 3 weeks or so," Garrett replied. "Sometimes more if I have extra pelts to trade. Winter is coming on, so I will probably be down more often in the next month stocking up. You live up there all alone?" He nodded. "Built my cabin about 7 years back. It suits me." Katherine tried to imagine it, living completely alone in the mountains with only wildlife for company, and could not quite wrap her mind around it. She had never lived anywhere without the constant press of people around her, the noise and bustle of city life. "Does it not get lonely?" Garrett was quiet for a moment, his boots making soft, sucking sounds in the mud. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but it is peaceful too. No expectations up there, no one telling you who you are supposed to be." There was something in his tone that suggested a story behind those words, but before Katherine could ask, they had arrived at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, a sturdy 2-story structure with a wide porch and curtains in the windows. Katherine hesitated at the bottom of the steps, not quite ready for the evening to end despite how strangely it had begun. "Thank you again, Mr. Voss," she said formally. "You were very kind to help me, Garrett," he corrected gently. "And like I said, it was not any trouble." He tipped his head in something that was not quite a bow, then started to turn away before pausing. "Miss Everett, I will probably be back in town in about 3 weeks. If you would like, I could teach you some things. Practical skills for living out here. Might help with your students too if you knew more about the life they are living." Katherine blinked in surprise. It was an unusual offer, especially from a man who supposedly preferred solitude, but there was nothing improper in his tone or manner, just a straightforward suggestion that actually made a fair amount of sense. "I would like that," she found herself saying. "And please call me Katherine." Something shifted in Garrett's expression, a softening around his eyes that made him look younger, less weathered. "Katherine, then. I will see you in 3 weeks. Katherine watched him walk away, his broad form disappearing into the gathering darkness, and realized she was already counting the days. The next 3 weeks passed slowly. Katherine threw herself into her work at the schoolhouse, a small building on the north side of town that served the dozen or so children, whose families stayed in and around White Oaks. She took Garrett's advice to heart and started asking the children about their lives, about what they needed to know, and began incorporating more practical lessons into her teaching. She taught them how to write clear, legible letters that could be read even when sent long distances, how to do the kind of arithmetic that mattered when buying supplies or selling goods, how to read maps and understand contracts so they could not be cheated. The children responded better than she had hoped, becoming more engaged when they could see the purpose behind the lessons. One boy, Tommy, who had barely spoken during her first 2 weeks, started bringing her questions about wildlife he had seen, wanting to know if she had books that might tell him more. She did not, but she made a note to see if she could order some from Santa Fe. Mrs. Henderson, her landlady, was a widow in her 50s with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, but she had been kind to Katherine in her own gruff way. Over dinner one evening, about 2 weeks after the storm, she caught Katherine staring out the window at the dark clouds gathering over the mountains. "Thinking about that mountain man of yours?" Mrs. Henderson asked, her tone suggesting she already knew the answer. Katherine felt heat rise to her cheeks. "He is not my mountain man, Mrs. Henderson. Mr. Voss simply offered to teach me some practical skills for living out here." Mrs. Henderson said in a way that indicated she did not believe a word of it. "Garrett Voss has been coming to White Oaks for years now, and I have never once seen him offer to teach anyone anything. keeps to himself, does his trading, and disappears back into the hills. But he carried you through the rain like you were made of spun glass, according to Mr. Patterson." "I was frightened," Katherine said defensively. "He was being kind." "Maybe," Mrs. Henderson allowed. "Or maybe he saw something in you worth coming down from his mountain for. That man has been hiding up there since he left the railroad work, and before you ask, no, I will not tell you why. That is his story to share if he chooses. But you think on this, Katherine. A man like that does not offer his time lightly." Katherine did think on it, more than she wanted to admit. She found herself wondering what had driven Garrett to the mountains, what he did with his days up there, whether he ever thought about that evening in the storm. She told herself she was being foolish, that he had simply been kind to someone in distress and nothing more, but she could not quite shake the memory of how safe she had felt in his arms, how his presence had pushed back the fear that usually consumed her entirely. 3 weeks to the day after the storm, Katherine was sweeping the schoolhouse steps when she saw a familiar broad-shouldered figure walking up the street leading a pack mule loaded with furs. Her heart did an unexpected flip in her chest, and she had to force herself to finish her sweeping rather than rushing down to meet him like an eager child. Garrett spotted her after he finished his business at the trading post, and the smile that crossed his face when he changed direction to head toward the schoolhouse made Katherine's stomach flutter in a way she had not experienced in years. He looked the same as she remembered, maybe a bit more tanned from time in the mountain sun, his hair tied back with a leather cord and his shirt straining across shoulders that looked like they could carry the world. "Katherine," he greeted as he climbed the schoolhouse steps. "You been well?" "I have," she said, trying to sound calm despite her racing pulse. "And you?" "Well enough. Brought down a good haul this time. Should keep me stocked through winter if I do not come down again." The thought of not seeing him for months sent an unexpected pang through Katherine's chest, but she pushed it aside. "You said you might teach me some things, if you are still interested." "I am very interested." They agreed to meet the next morning early, before the children arrived for lessons. Garrett suggested they go up into the foothills a ways, where he could show her things that could not be learned in town. And Katherine agreed despite a small voice in her head warning her about going off alone with a man she barely knew. But every instinct she had said Garrett was safe, that he would never hurt her, and Katherine had learned to trust her instincts. That night, another storm rolled through White Oaks, and Katherine lay in her bed with her blankets pulled over her head, trembling with every crack of thunder. She thought about Garrett, probably dry and safe in his mountain cabin, and wondered if he could hear the storms from up there, if they sounded different when you were above them instead of beneath them. The thought did not make the fear go away, but it gave her something else to focus on, and eventually, exhaustion pulled her into fitful sleep. Morning broke clear and beautiful, the storm having washed the dust from the air and left everything smelling of rain and sage. Katherine dressed in her most practical clothes, a simple cotton dress and sturdy boots she had bought when she first arrived, and met Garrett at the edge of town just as the sun was painting the mountains gold and orange. "Ready?" he asked, and Katherine nodded, following as he led the way up a trail that wound into the foothills. He walked with the easy confidence of someone who knew the land intimately, pointing out plants as they went and telling her what they were good for. This one helped with fever. That one could be made into tea that settled the stomach. These berries were safe to eat, but those would make you violently ill. Katherine tried to remember it all, wishing she had thought to bring paper to take notes, but Garrett was patient, repeating information when she asked, and showing her how to identify plants by their leaves and stems, not just their flowers or fruit. "Flowers do not last," he explained as they climbed higher. "The the town falling away below them until it looked like a handful of toy buildings scattered across the valley floor. You need to know how to recognize things year-round. They stopped near a cluster of rocks that provided shade from the rising sun, and Garrett showed her how to build a fire properly, how to arrange the wood so it would catch quickly and burn efficiently. His hands moved with practiced ease, and Katherine found herself watching the play of muscle in his forearms, the way his long fingers handled even small twigs with surprising delicacy. "Your turn," he said, stepping back, and Katherine tried to recreate what he had shown her. It took 3 attempts before she got it right, but when the flames finally caught and grew, she felt a surge of accomplishment that made her grin. "Good," Garrett said, and the approval in his voice made Katherine's smile grow even wider. They spent the next few hours working on different skills, Garrett showing her how to tell direction by the sun and stars, how to spot signs of water, how to walk quietly and read the tracks animals left behind. He was a good teacher, patient and clear, never making her feel stupid when she made mistakes. Around midday, they sat on a flat rock eating the lunch Katherine had packed, dried beef and bread and apples from Mrs. Henderson's tree. The view from their vantage point was breathtaking, miles of New Mexico territory spreading out in all directions, all red rock and golden grass and endless sky. "It is beautiful up here," Katherine said quietly. "I can see why you love it." Garrett nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon in a way that suggested he was always watching, always aware. "It is honest land. It will kill you if you are not careful, but it does not lie about what it is." "Is that why you left the railroad?" Katherine asked, then immediately regretted the personal question. "I apologize, that is none of my business." But Garrett did not seem offended. He was quiet for a long moment, then said, "I worked on the railroad for 2 years after the war. The work was brutal and the foreman was worse. He had favorites and scapegoats, and if you ended up on the wrong side of his opinion, life became hell." He paused, his jaw tightening. "There was an accident. Cave in at a tunnel we were digging. 3 men died, and it happened because the foreman cut corners, did not timber it properly. I told the company representatives what really happened, testified against him." "That was brave," Katherine said softly. "It was necessary," Garrett corrected, "but it made me enemies. Men I had worked beside threatened me, said I should have kept my mouth shut, that workers did not go against management. The foreman lost his job, but he had friends, and they made it clear I was not safe. So I took the money I had saved and came here, up into the mountains where no one cared about railroad politics or who said what to whom." Katherine absorbed this, understanding better now the kind of man Garrett was. He had chosen the hard right over the easy wrong, even knowing what it would cost him. "You did the right thing," she said firmly. "Those men's families deserved the truth." "I know," Garrett said simply, "but knowing you did right does not always make the consequences easier to bear." They were quiet after that, but it was a comfortable silence, the kind that did not need filling. Katherine felt something shifting between them, a deepening of the connection that had begun during the storm, built on shared stories and growing understanding. Over the next 2 weeks, they fell into a pattern. Garrett stayed in town rather than returning immediately to his cabin, sleeping in a small room above the trading post and spending his days teaching Katherine skills she had never imagined needing. He showed her how to shoot, his big hands gentle as he corrected her stance and taught her how to breathe through the recoil. He taught her about weather patterns, how to read the clouds and wind and know when storms were coming. That part was harder for Katherine. Even talking about storms made her anxious, but Garrett was patient, never pushing too hard, always ready to distract her when the fear became too much. And slowly, Very slowly, Katherine began to understand that knowledge was its own kind of power. The storms were still terrifying, but knowing more about them, understanding what caused thunder and lightning, made them feel slightly less like random acts of divine violence. The townsfolk began to notice them spending time together, and Katherine heard the whispers, saw the knowing looks. Mrs. Henderson became increasingly less subtle with her comments about what a fine man Garrett was, how he would make a good husband for a woman brave enough to handle mountain life. Katherine tried to ignore it all, telling herself that Garrett was simply being kind, teaching her the way he might teach anyone who asked. But then there were moments that made her wonder. The way his hand would linger on her arm when he was showing her something, warm and steady. The way he watched her sometimes when he thought she was not looking, his expression soft in a way that made her heart race. The way he smiled at her, really smiled, like she was something precious he had not expected to find. 3 weeks after that first lesson in the foothills, another storm rolled in during the afternoon. Katherine was at the schoolhouse with the children when the sky began to darken, and she felt the familiar panic rising in her throat. But she forced it down, keeping her voice steady as she dismissed the students early and told them to get home before the weather turned. The first rumble of thunder came just as the last child ran out the door, and Katherine gripped the edge of her desk hard enough to hurt. She wanted to hide under it, wanted to run to Mrs. Henderson's boarding house and bury herself under blankets, but instead, she made herself stand there, breathing deeply the way Garrett had taught her, counting between the lightning flash and the thunder to judge how far away the storm was. She did not hear him come in, but suddenly Garrett was there, his presence filling the small schoolhouse. He did not say anything, just came to stand beside her, solid and real, his shoulder touching hers. Katherine leaned into him without thinking, and his arm came around her shoulders, pulling her close against his side. "You are doing good," he said quietly as thunder boomed overhead, breathing through it. "I am terrified," Katherine admitted, her voice shaking. "I know. But you are standing here anyway. That is brave." They stayed like that through the worst of it, Garrett holding her as the storm raged outside, occasionally murmuring quiet observations about the weather that gave Katherine something to focus on besides her fear. He pointed out how the lightning came in sheets sometimes and forks others, explained how you could tell a storm's intensity by the time between thunder rolls, kept up a steady stream of information that Katherine clung to like a lifeline. When the storm finally passed, and Katherine's heartbeat had slowed to something approaching normal, she realized she was pressed fully against Garrett's chest, his arms wrapped around her, and her face buried in his shirt. She should have been embarrassed, should have pulled away, but it felt too good, too right to be held like this. "Thank you," she whispered against his chest. "Always," Garrett replied, and something about the way he said it made Katherine look up. His face was very close, his pine-colored eyes dark and intense as they searched hers. She saw the moment he decided, saw his intention in the slight tensing of his jaw, and then he was lowering his head and she was rising on her toes and their lips met in a kiss that felt like coming home. Garrett kissed the way he did everything else, with complete focus and surprising gentleness, his big hands cradling her face like she was something infinitely precious. Katherine kissed him back with all the emotion she had been holding in for weeks, all the longing and hope and growing love she had not wanted to name. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Garrett rested his forehead against hers. "Katherine," he said, his voice rough, "I need you to know what you would be choosing. If this is what you want, if I am what you want, it means a hard life. The mountains are not forgiving and winter up there can be brutal. I cannot offer you the comfortable town life you are used to." "I am not used to comfort," Katherine said firmly. I am used to making do and figuring things out. And yes, Garrett, you are what I want. You have been what I wanted since you pulled me out from under that wagon." His smile was like sunrise, bright and warm and full of promise. "I have been half in love with you since you looked at me with those wide eyes and told me you were perfectly fine while shaking hard enough to rattle bones." Katherine laughed, surprising herself, and kissed him again just because she could. They stood there in the schoolhouse as the last of the storm clouds moved on, holding each other and making quiet promises, planning a future that felt both terrifying and exactly right. The next months were a careful dance of courtship and practicality. Katherine continued teaching while Garrett prepared his mountain cabin for a second occupant, coming down to town every week now instead of every 3 weeks. Each visit brought small gifts, things he had made with his own hands. A wooden box with a tight-fitting lid to keep her papers dry. A fur-lined cloak for winter. A pair of boots made from soft leather that fit her perfectly because he had carefully traced her feet while she slept one afternoon, Mrs. Henderson conspiring with him in a way that made Katherine's heart swell. Garrett courted her properly, calling on her at the boarding house under Mrs. Henderson's watchful but approving eye, taking her on walks through town and up into the foothills, always respectful but never hiding his affection. The town quickly accepted them as a couple, and Katherine found herself welcomed more warmly into the community as Garrett's chosen woman. In November, Garrett asked her to marry him properly, getting down on one knee in Mrs. Henderson's parlor with a ring he had carved from mountain stone and set with a small turquoise he had found in a creek bed. Katherine said yes before he finished asking, throwing herself into his arms with such enthusiasm they nearly toppled over. They were married in early December by the circuit preacher who came through White Oaks, in a simple ceremony at the church with half the town in attendance. Katherine wore a new dress, pale blue cotton that Mrs. Henderson had helped her sew, and Garrett wore his best clothes, his long hair neatly braided and his face clean-shaven for the first time since Katherine had known him. He looked younger without the beard, and impossibly handsome, and Katherine could barely concentrate on the preacher's words because she was too busy memorizing every detail of this moment. When the preacher pronounced them married and told Garrett he could kiss his bride, Garrett pulled Katherine close and kissed her thoroughly enough to make some of the older ladies gasp, and the younger ones sigh with envy. Katherine did not care about propriety at all, kissing her husband back with all the love bursting through her chest. The town threw them a celebration at the saloon, which cleared out the gambling tables and brought in tables laden with food instead. There was music and dancing, and Garrett proved surprisingly graceful for such a large man, spinning Katherine around the floor until she was dizzy and laughing. She had never been happier in her entire life. They spent their wedding night at the boarding house, Mrs. Henderson having tactfully given them the best room and made herself scarce. Garrett was gentle and patient, his big hands reverent as he helped Katherine out of her wedding dress. And when they finally came together, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Two people who had been made to fit together finally becoming one. The next morning, they loaded Katherine's belongings onto Garrett's mule and began the long climb up into the Jicarilla Mountains. Katherine had resigned from her teaching position, recommending young Sarah Miller, who had been helping her for the past month, to take over. It had been hard to say goodbye to the children, but she was ready for this new chapter, ready to see the place that Garrett loved so much. The cabin was a full day's journey from town, up trails that grew progressively steeper and narrower. Katherine's legs ached and her lungs burned from the altitude, but every time she started to flag, Garrett was there with a steadying hand or an encouraging word, pointing out landmarks and telling her stories about the land they traveled through. They reached the cabin as the sun was setting, and Katherine stood staring at what would be her home, taking it all in. The cabin was larger than she had expected, built from solid pine logs with a stone chimney and real glass windows that must have cost a fortune to haul up the mountain. It sat in a small meadow surrounded by tall pines, with a creek running nearby and views that stretched for miles. Behind the cabin was a sturdy barn for the mule and storage, and Katherine could see a well-maintained vegetable garden, now dormant for winter. "It is beautiful," she breathed, and Garrett's face relaxed into a smile. "Come see inside," he said, and carried her over the threshold in the traditional way, both of them laughing. The interior was simpler but well made. One large main room with a stone fireplace, a sleeping area separated by a curtain, a cooking area with a proper stove, and shelves lined with supplies. Furs covered the floor and the bed, and there was a rocking chair by the fireplace that looked hand-carved. It was rustic and rough, nothing like the life Katherine had known in Philadelphia, but it felt like home in a way that the boarding house never had. They settled into married life with surprising ease. Garrett taught Katherine everything she needed to know about mountain living, and she proved an apt student. She learned to cook over the wood stove, to preserve meat and vegetables, to chop wood and haul water and do the thousand small tasks that made up daily life. Her hands grew calloused, and her body grew stronger, and she found satisfaction in the work that she had never felt in the softer life she had left behind. Winter came hard and heavy, snow piling up around the cabin until some days they could barely open the door. Katherine had been nervous about being so isolated, worried she would feel trapped, but instead she found the quiet peaceful. They spent long evenings by the fire, Garrett teaching her to work leather and Katherine reading aloud from the books she had brought, sharing stories and dreams and learning each other in all the ways that mattered. The storms were hardest. The first time thunder boomed through the mountains, echoing off the peaks, Katherine nearly came out of her skin with fear. But Garrett was there immediately, pulling her into his arms and holding her close, his deep voice steady and calm as he talked her through it. He never made her feel weak or foolish, just accepted her fear and helped her face it, storm after storm through that long winter. "I have you," he would say every single time. "You are safe. I will not let anything hurt you." And gradually, so gradually she almost did not notice it happening, the storms became more bearable. They still frightened her, the thunder still made her heart race and her hands shake, but with Garrett's arms around her, the fear was manageable. He became her safe harbor, her shelter from every storm, and Katherine loved him more with each passing day. Spring came slowly to the mountains, the snow melting in fits and starts, revealing the brown grass and sleeping earth beneath. Katherine had never seen anything as beautiful as the mountain spring, wildflowers exploding across the meadows in waves of color, baby animals everywhere, the world coming back to life. She started a new garden, larger than Garrett's previous one, and he helped her fence it against deer and rabbits. In May, Katherine realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, the signs unmistakable, but she waited to be certain before telling Garrett. When she finally said the words over breakfast one morning, watching his face carefully, Garrett went completely still for a moment before a smile spread across his face that was brighter than the sun. "A baby," he said wonderingly, then crossed to her in 2 long strides and picked her up, spinning her around gently before kissing her soundly. "We are going to have a baby." "We are," Katherine confirmed, laughing and crying at the same time. "Are you happy?" "Happy does not cover it," Garrett said, his hand settling over her still flat stomach with a reverence that made Katherine's throat tight. You have given me everything, Katherine. Everything I did not know I needed. The pregnancy was easier than Katherine had feared. She felt sick in the mornings for the first few months, but Garrett was attentive, brewing her ginger tea and making sure she rested. As she grew larger, he became increasingly protective, taking over the heavier chores and fussing over her in a way that she found both annoying and endearing. In early August, when Katherine was getting close to her time, Garrett insisted they go down to White Oaks so she could be near the doctor when the baby came. Katherine protested, saying women had been having babies in the mountains since the dawn of time, but Garrett was immovable on this point. "I will not risk you or the baby," he said firmly. "We go to town. You have the baby with the doctor nearby, and when you and the child are strong enough, we come back home." So they made the journey down, moving slowly to accommodate Katherine's bulk and frequent need to rest. Mrs. Henderson welcomed them back with delight, having already prepared a room and recruited 2 other women to help with the birth when the time came. Katherine went into labor on a quiet Tuesday evening, 3 weeks after they arrived in town. The pains started gradually, and at first she thought they were just more of the false contractions she had been having for weeks. But these grew stronger and closer together, and by midnight she was gripping Garrett's hand hard enough to leave marks while Mrs. Henderson and the midwife she had brought in worked around them. It was a long, difficult labor. The baby was large, taking after Garrett's size, and Katherine pushed for hours, exhausted and scared and hurting in ways she had not imagined possible. But every time she wanted to give up, Garrett was there, his face pale but determined, telling her she could do this, she was strong enough, just a little more. Their son was born as the sun rose, coming into the world with a lusty cry that made everyone laugh with relief. He was big and healthy, with a shock of dark hair and his father's nose, and when the midwife placed him in Katherine's arms, she felt love so fierce it took her breath away. "A boy," she whispered, looking up at Garrett with tears streaming down her face. "We have a son." Garrett was crying too, unashamed tears running down his weathered cheeks as he reached out with one finger to touch their son's tiny hand. "He is perfect," he said hoarsely. "You are perfect. I love you so much, Katherine." They named him Gabriel, after Garrett's father, and he was the light of their lives from his first breath. Garrett was a devoted father, his huge hands surprisingly gentle as he changed diapers and rocked Gabriel to sleep, singing old songs in a rumbling voice that the baby seemed to find soothing. They stayed in White Oaks for 6 weeks, until Katherine was healed and Gabriel was feeding well and gaining weight. Then they packed up and made the journey back to their mountain cabin, Gabriel strapped to Katherine's chest in a carrier Garrett had made from soft leather and cloth. Life on the mountain with a baby was challenging but joyful. Gabriel was a good baby, easy-going and quick to smile, and he seemed to thrive in the clean mountain air. Katherine learned to do chores with a baby on her hip, and Garrett built a cradle that he could rock with his foot while working at the table. The first time a storm rolled through after Gabriel's birth, Katherine felt the familiar fear rising, but it was different now. She had to be strong for her son, had to stay calm so she would not pass her terror on to him. And Garrett was there as always, gathering both her and Gabriel close, shielding them with his body and his presence while the thunder boomed and the lightning flashed. "We are all safe," he murmured. "Our family is safe. I have you both." Katherine believed him. In his arms, holding their son, she felt protected from anything the world could throw at them. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons. Winters were quiet and cozy. The 3 of them snowed in together, Garrett teaching Gabriel his letters on a slate board while Katherine sewed or cooked. Springs were for planting and renewal, the meadow around their cabin exploding with life. Summers were warm and golden. Gabriel growing brown and strong, helping his father with the work, learning to chop wood and care for the animals and track game through the forest. Autumns were for harvest and preparation, putting up food for winter and enjoying the spectacular colors that painted the mountains. When Gabriel was 3, Katherine became pregnant again. This time she knew what to expect, and the pregnancy seemed easier, though Garrett was just as protective as he had been the first time. Their second child, a daughter they named Grace, was born in the cabin with just Garrett to help. The labor went quickly, and Grace arrived during a spring rainstorm, smaller than Gabriel had been but just as healthy, with Katherine's light brown hair and Garrett's green eyes. Gabriel was fascinated by his little sister, wanting to help with everything, and Garrett had to constantly remind him to be gentle. Grace adored her big brother from the start, her eyes following him around the cabin whenever he was in view. 2 years after Grace came another son. This one they named George after Katherine's father. George was quieter than his siblings, more thoughtful, happy to sit and watch the world rather than immediately diving into it. He had Katherine's temperament but Garrett's build, and from an early age showed an interest in the natural world that delighted them both. Their cabin life was full and happy. Garrett still made trips to White Oaks every few months, sometimes taking the children so Katherine could have a few days of peace, sometimes going alone so he could handle heavy trading. The children loved town visits, the excitement of seeing other people, and the treats Mrs. Henderson always had waiting, but they were always eager to return to their mountain home. Katherine had never imagined she could be this happy. The frightened woman who had cowered under a wagon during a storm felt like a different person, someone from another life. She was still afraid of thunder and lightning, probably always would be, but the fear no longer ruled her. With Garrett beside her, she had learned to face the storms, to breathe through them and remember that they would pass. One evening when Gabriel was 10, Grace 7, and George 5, a massive storm rolled over the mountains. It was the kind of storm that made the cabin shake, thunder so loud it seemed to come from inside the earth itself, lightning that turned night into day. The children huddled together on the big bed, Grace crying softly and George pale and wide-eyed. Katherine felt the old fear clawing at her throat, but she took a deep breath and went to sit with her children, gathering them close. "It is all right," she told them, keeping her voice steady. "It is just a storm. It will pass." "Are you scared, Mama?" Gabriel asked, because he was old enough to remember other storms, other times when his mother had needed his father's strength. "Yes," Katherine admitted, seeing no point in lying. "I am scared. Thunder and lightning have frightened me since I was younger than you. But being scared does not mean we cannot be brave." Garrett came to sit beside them, his arm going around Katherine's shoulders in the familiar gesture that had comforted her through 100 storms. Together, they held their children through the worst of it, and when the thunder finally faded and the rain softened, Grace looked up at her mother with wondering eyes. "You were very brave, Mama," she said seriously. "We all were," Katherine replied, kissing her daughter's forehead. "Sometimes being brave just means staying calm when you want to run away." That night, after the children were asleep and the storm had passed completely, Katherine and Garrett sat on their porch watching the stars emerge from behind the clearing clouds. The air smelled clean and fresh, and somewhere in the forest an owl was calling. "Do you ever regret it?" Garrett asked quietly. "Leaving town, living up here, the hard life?" Katherine looked at him in genuine surprise. "Never, not once. This life, this family, all of it is everything I never knew I wanted." She took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "You held me through every storm, Garrett, literally and figuratively. You made me braver than I ever thought I could be." "You were always brave," Garrett corrected. "I just gave you a safe place to find your strength." They sat in comfortable silence, Catherine's head on Garrett's shoulder, his arm around her waist, watching the stars wheel overhead. Below them, the mountains stretched out in endless waves, and in the cabin behind them, their children slept safe and warm. The years continued to pass. The children grew, each developing their own personalities and interests. Gabriel inherited his father's size and strength, growing into a young man who could fell a tree or track a deer with equal skill. Grace was bright and fierce, afraid of nothing, with a laugh that could light up the darkest day. George remained quieter but developed an encyclopedic knowledge of plants and animals that surprised even Garrett. When Gabriel was 16, he started talking about wanting to see more of the world, maybe travel to Santa Fe or even as far as California. Catherine's heart ached at the thought of her firstborn leaving, but she understood. He had his father's restless spirit, the need to know what lay beyond the next mountain. "Let him go," Garrett advised when Katherine worried aloud. "He will come back. These mountains get in your blood. But he needs to see what else is out there so he can choose this life for himself, not just live it because it is all he knows." So when Gabriel turned 18, they gave him their blessing, along with supplies and money Garrett had been saving. Gabriel promised to write, to stay safe, and to come home, and then he was gone, walking down the mountain trail with his pack on his back, turning once to wave before disappearing around a bend. Katherine cried that night, pressed against Garrett's chest while he held her and stroked her hair. "He will be fine," he murmured. "He is strong and smart, and we raised him right." "I know," Katherine said, "but he is my baby." "He will always be our baby," Garrett agreed, "even when he is a grown man with children of his own." Gabriel kept his promise, writing letters that arrived every few months when Garrett went to town to collect them. He had made it to Santa Fe and found work as a guide for wagon trains heading west. He loved the work, he said, but he missed the mountains and the family. He would be home to visit soon. Grace, at 15, had no interest in leaving. She had her father's love for the mountains and declared regularly that she would live nowhere else. She had also started attracting attention from boys in White Oaks whenever they visited, much to Garrett's consternation. "She is too young," he grumbled one evening after a boy had stammered through asking permission to write to Grace. "She is the same age I was when I married you," Katherine pointed out, amused. "That was different." "How?" Garrett struggled for an answer, finally admitting, "Because she is my daughter and I am not ready." But a year later, when a young man named Thomas, son of a rancher from the valley, began seriously courting Grace with clear, honorable intentions, even Garrett had to admit he was a good match. Thomas was respectful and hard-working, and most importantly, Grace lit up like sunrise whenever he was around. They were married when Grace was 18, in a ceremony on the mountain meadow with half of White Oaks making the trek up for the celebration. Katherine cried happy tears watching her daughter pledge her life to a good man, and Garrett gave Thomas a very clear talk about what would happen if he ever made Grace unhappy. Thomas went pale but nodded seriously, and Garrett clapped him on the shoulder hard enough to make him stagger. Grace and Thomas built a cabin in the foothills, close enough for regular visits but far enough for their own independence. Within a year, they made Katherine and Garrett grandparents with the birth of a daughter they named Katherine, after her grandmother. George, at 14, showed no interest in either leaving or in romance. He was content with his books and his observations of nature, talking about maybe becoming a doctor someday, studying plants and their medicinal properties. Katherine encouraged this dream, proud of her thoughtful son. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Garrett took Katherine on a journey to a place he had never shown anyone, They rode for most of a day, climbing higher into the mountains than Katherine had ever been, until they reached a small lake fed by snowmelt, so clear you could see straight to the bottom. It was surrounded by peaks that still held snow even in summer, and the silence was absolute except for the wind and the call of birds. "I found this place my second year in the mountains," Garrett said as they stood at the water's edge. "I come here sometimes when I need to think. But I have never brought anyone else. I wanted to share it with you." Katherine looked at the pristine beauty surrounding them and felt overwhelmed with love for this man who kept finding new ways to show her how much she meant to him. "It is perfect," she whispered. They spent the night camped by the lake, making love under the stars like they had not done in years. Young again, despite the gray threading through their hair and the lines on their faces. They talked about their children, about the life they had built, about growing old together in their mountain home. "I never thanked you properly," Katherine said as they lay wrapped in blankets, watching the sky lighten toward dawn. "For what? For holding me through every storm. For never making me feel weak or foolish, for loving me exactly as I am." Garrett pulled her closer, kissing her temple. "Katherine, you have given me everything. A home, a family, a reason to come down from the mountain. You turned my cabin into a home and my life into something worth living. If anyone should be grateful, it is me." "Then we are both grateful," Katherine decided. "Both blessed, Garrett agreed. They returned home to find Gabriel had come back for a visit, arriving the day after they left and waiting for them with George. He looked older, weathered by travel and experience, but his smile was the same when he hugged his mother and clasped hands with his father. "I wanted to tell you in person," he said over dinner that night. "I have been offered a permanent position managing a guide service in Santa Fe. It is good money, steady work, and I have met someone. A girl named Helen. Her father runs the general store. I want to marry her, start a family, build a life there." Katherine felt the bittersweet pang of a mother watching her child truly leave the nest, but she smiled and took her son's hands. "We are so proud of you, Gabriel. Bring Helen to visit when you can. I want to meet the woman who captured your heart." "She reminds me of you, Mama," Gabriel said with a grin. "Stubborn and brave and does not take any nonsense," Garrett laughed. "Then she will fit right into this family." Life continued its steady rhythm. George eventually did leave for medical school, studying in Santa Fe with Gabriel's help, returning home each summer full of new knowledge. Grace and Thomas had 3 more children, 2 boys and another girl, and their ranch prospered. Gabriel married his Helen, and they had twin boys who he brought to visit every couple of years. City children wide-eyed at the mountain wilderness their father had grown up in. Katherine and Garrett grew older together, their bodies slowing but their love never fading. Garrett's hair turned silver and his back grew stiffer from years of hard work, but he was still the strongest man Katherine knew, still her shelter in every storm. Katherine's hands became gnarled with age and her eyes needed spectacles for reading, but she remained the heart of their family, the one everyone came home to. On their 30th anniversary, another massive storm rolled over the mountains. It was late summer, the kind of storm that came with hail and wind that bent trees nearly double. Katherine stood at the window watching it come. And yes, her heart beat faster, and yes, fear prickled at her spine, but it was distant now, manageable. Garrett came to stand behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist, and Katherine leaned back against his chest, solid and warm and safe as he had always been. "Still scared?" he asked softly. "A little," Katherine admitted. "But I have you." "Always," Garrett said, and the word carried the weight of 30 years of promises kept, of storms weathered together, of a love that had only grown stronger with time. The storm broke over them in full fury. thunder shaking the cabin and lightning illuminating the meadow in stark white flashes. But inside, Katherine stood in her husband's arms, unafraid, and when she closed her eyes she could see it all. Every storm he had held her through, every fear he had helped her face, every moment of joy and sorrow and love that had brought them to this place. "I love you," she said, turning in his arms to look up at his weathered, beloved face. "I love you more than I have words to say." Garrett smiled, the same smile that had stolen her heart 30 years ago when he pulled her from beneath a wagon and carried her through the rain. "And I love you," he said, "through every storm, Katherine, through every storm." Outside, the thunder rolled and the lightning flashed, but inside their mountain cabin, surrounded by 3 decades of love and memories, Katherine Voss stood unafraid in her husband's arms and knew that whatever storms life still had to bring, they would face them together as they always had, and she would never be afraid again.